welcome back to Organized Crime News Weekly. This is the weekly podcast where we bring you up-to-date news regarding the world of organized crime. My name is Key Vedati, and let's get right down to it. Our first story this week comes directly from British Columbia, Canada, where Jared Bacon of the infamous Bacon Brothers was charged this past week with aggravated assault after he was arrested on February 1st. The charge relates to a shooting incident that occurred outside a small business in Fort Nelson, British Columbia. Bacon was arrested along with another man named John Chass. Some background on Jared Bacon. He and his brothers, Jonathan and Jamie, they grew up in a normal middle-class family in Abbotsford, British Columbia, which is a suburb of Vancouver. And they started their careers in crime sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s. Obviously, with these things, it's kind of hard to tell exactly when it would have started. And they began working with the United Nations Gang. The United Nations Gang is a multi-ethnic gang that has been around in Vancouver since the late 1990s. And since the 1990s, they have formed strong international connections with Mexican drug cartels, and they've even expanded into East Asia and formed links with different criminal organizations over there. But the Bacons worked with the United Nations Gang mainly to smuggle drugs, most notably cocaine and marijuana. British Columbia is one of the top places that marijuana is grown in North America. They're particularly known for a strand of marijuana called BC Bud. And the Bacons were working with the United Nations Gang to bring that weed down to the United States. Apparently, the Bacon brothers had a pretty rocky relationship with the leader of the UN gang, whose name was Clay Rouche. In around 2006, the Bacon brothers split off from the UN gang, and they formed an alliance with the Red Scorpions, which is a rival of the UN gang. And the Bacon brothers joining the Red Scorpions coincides with the start of the Lower Mainland Gang War of 2007 to 2009. Vancouver and all the surrounding cities are in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. That's where it gets the name Lower Mainland. And this war, in just 2 years, saw more than 20 people killed and more than 40 wounded. And there were many other gangs involved in this conflict, such as the Indo-Canadian gangs, which are very prominent throughout all of British Columbia. And the Red Scorpions have an alliance with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Jared Bacon was convicted of cocaine trafficking charges in 2012, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He got released in 2017 before he violated his parole 2 more times. But he was finally released in August of 2022. His brother Jonathan was murdered the previous year in August of 2011. He was at a resort in Kelowna, British Columbia. While he was exiting the resort, the car he was in was ambushed by hitmen, supposedly working for the United Nations, and Jonathan was mortally wounded, and Hells Angel Larry Amaro, who was also traveling in his car with him, was seriously wounded. He would later go on to be convicted of revenge killings regarding the shooting, and he is currently serving an 18-year prison sentence for one of these murders. The last brother, Jamie, pleaded guilty in 2020 to his role in the shooting back in 2007. It was called the Surrey 6 Massacre, where 6 men were killed. But despite 6 men being murdered, he was able to plead guilty and get only 18 years in prison. So, pretty light sentence. So it appears that Jared Bacon has involved in crime once again. It's unknown how serious of a player he is anymore. One of his brothers is dead. The other one is going to be locked up for at least another decade. So it remains to be seen how his future will play out. It remains to be seen if he will be convicted of this shooting. I think we have not heard the last of the Bacon brothers of British Columbia. This next story comes from Turkey, but it is regarding 3 Montenegrin men. Montenegro is a small country in the Balkans in Eastern Europe. It used to be part of Serbia, but became its own country in the early 2000s. 3 Montenegrin men by the names of Željko Bojanic, Radoje Zivkovic, and Zdravko Harinovic. Hope I said those names right. Serbian names are very difficult to pronounce. Anyways, these 3 men were convicted of murder in Turkey this past week, and they were sentenced to life in prison Person they were convicted for murdering was Jovan Vukotic back in September of 2022 in Istanbul. Vukotic was shot by a motorcyclist while riding in his car with his wife and daughter. The reason we're talking about this story is because Jovan Vukotic was the leader of the Scaljari clan, which is based out of the Montenegrin town of Kotor. For the past 10 years, the Scaljari clan has been embroiled in a pretty brutal and vicious war with their rivals, the Kavak clan. And both of these clans are two of the most powerful criminal organizations in all of the Balkans. They are responsible for a huge percentage of the cocaine that is coming into Europe from South America. The Montenegrins in particular are known for their ability to hire crews for sailing boats that go all the way to South America and bring the cocaine back. The Montenegrins have a pretty solid control over the nautical routes that cocaine takes to get to Europe. But this war between the Kavak and the Scaljari clans began in 2014. Before 2014, they had been one group known as the Kotor clan that worked together in the city of Kotor out of Montenegro. But in 2014, there was a cocaine deal that went bad in Valencia, Spain. Spain being one of the key destinations for cocaine coming into Western Europe. Also, a lot of criminal organizations throughout the world have established bases in Spain. But since then, the war between the Scaljari and the Kavak clans has led to over 100 murders, allegedly. These include crazy assassinations, such as a member of one of these clans being shot dead by a sniper while in a prison yard, many car bombings, recruiting ultra soccer fans, carry out assassinations and deal drugs for them. But the Kavak clan has clearly come out on top in this war. They're rumored to have protection from top government officials in Serbia and Montenegro. They are even alleged to have the protection of the Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić. And this political protection has allowed them to gain the upper hand in this war. And because of this, the Scaljari clan has been greatly weakened. The murder of Jovan Vukotic back in September of 2022 was perhaps the nail of the coffin in the clan. They still continue to operate. Even a couple months ago in Montenegro, there were a couple Kavak clan members who were shot dead by Scaljari clan members. So the war is still very active, but Kavak still maintains the upper hand. And I expect more murders to come from this feud that looks like it has no end in sight. The next story comes from Marseille, France, where this past Tuesday, notorious French gangster Andre Surmolassi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was shot dead in Marseille this past Tuesday at the age of 70. And he was killed near his official workplace, which was an alcoholic distribution company. Obviously, when you have a history of organized crime, you have to show that you have an occupation to not arouse as much suspicion from authorities. But he was shot dead by a gunman who fled on a scooter. No one really knows why he's been killed, but this murder comes in the backdrop of the power grab of the DZ Mafia, which is a pretty violent drug gang that has sprung up in Marseille underworld in recent years, mainly made up of men with North African roots. And for the past few years, they've been waging wars against various other gangs in Marseille, such as the Yoda gang, and they're currently waging a war with the Blacks gang. And they appear to have beaten the Yoda gang, and it appears they've already beaten the Yoda gang, and they are slowly gunning down the Blacks into submission. And the DZ Mafia is pretty well known for hiring teenagers through social media platforms to carry out murders. So his murder comes in the background of all this stuff going on with the DZ Mafia fighting off all their rivals. But despite all this drug violence that has been in Marseille in recent years, Surmolassi is alleged by some close to him, which, you gotta take it with a grain of salt because they don't want to portray him in a bad way. They say they had no role in the drug trade. I don't know how true that is, but it could be. But he was sentenced to 6 years in prison back in 2000 for bribing a cop. In addition, he was convicted several times of pimping, and he is also suspected of being the mastermind of robbery of an armored truck back in 2013, in which 7 million euros were stolen. And he was also alleged to be heavily involved in illegal gambling, even placing illegal slot machines throughout bars in all of Marseille. But he was targeted for murder previously. He survived an assassination attempt about 20 years ago. I couldn't find the exact time. During this assassination attempt, he was shot at by men on a motorcycle while he was driving his car through Marseille. Some experts in the Marseille underworld, the French underworld, are saying that his death is kind of the end of an era, that he's the last of the old school French gangsters, because now the power in the French and Marseille underworld seems to be held by gangs that are made up mostly of men of North African descent, such as the DZ Mafia, the Yoda Gang, the Blacks. But we shall see how long this trend lasts. I don't expect it'll end anytime soon, and I think that indigenous French gangsters are definitely on the decline as the DZ Mafia and other groups continue to expand and take over all of the drug corners throughout Marseille and throughout other cities as well. All right, the next story comes from Portugal, which is a place that I don't really think of when I think of organized crime, but pretty interesting thing happened this past week there. On the morning of January 29th, a burning body was discovered in a dumpster in Lisbon, Portugal, and the victim was identified as 20-year-old Brazilian Julio Fernando Santos Silva of Rio de Janeiro. And so far, his murder is suspected to be linked to Commando Vermelho, which translates to Red Command in English. Commando Vermelho is a Brazilian criminal organization that was formed in the late 1970s as sort of a socialist movement in prison to advocate for better rights for prisoners, but eventually it morphed into something more sinister, which was a cocaine trafficking organization. I know last week I talked about the PCC, the Primeiro Comando de Capital. They came up in the early 1990s and they had a similar formation. And these two groups are fierce rivals in the Brazilian underworld, with PCC being based out of Sao Paulo and the Commando Vermelho being based out of Rio de Janeiro. Going back to the murder of Santos Silva, it's thought that 5 members of the Commando were sent to Portugal, where they allegedly kidnapped him and took him to an abandoned house where he was beaten before he was murdered and set on fire. And this is allegedly because he got on the wrong side of some members of the command back in Rio de Janeiro. And days after he was killed, another man was killed in Portugal. This time it was a convicted drug trafficker and rapist named Felisberto Diaz, who was nicknamed Noti. And he was gunned down outside a gym in the city of Amadora in Portugal. But he's suspected of being killed by PCC instead of the Commando Vermelho. It said the reason he was killed is because he stole hundreds of kilos of cocaine from the PCC. Obviously, it's too early to exactly determine the real cause for his murder. And I think these two murders are interesting because Portugal is not a country known for murders, for organized crime, and both the PCC and CV are Brazilian criminal organizations. It makes sense for them to set up shop in Portugal because and it makes sense for them to set up in Portugal because they obviously have the same languages. It's thought they both expanded to Portugal in order to expand their money laundering operations, and they do this with the use of shell companies, and they launder a lot of money through cryptocurrencies as well. They also have allegedly opened up a lot of beauty salons and restaurants in Portugal to launder their money. But this is all part of an international expansion regarding both groups, as both of them are heavily involved in the international cocaine trade, particularly the PCC, which is more powerful internationally than the CV. And the PCC has also set up shop in West Africa, in Portuguese-speaking countries in West Africa, like Guinea-Bissau particularly, which is one of the top cocaine transit spots in all of the world. And it's also set up a strong base in Mozambique. But the expansion of these two groups, particularly the PCC, I think is something that us that observe organized crime are going to notice a lot more in the years to come. They have grown in the past 30 years from a simple band of prisoners advocating for rights to one of the largest, most powerful, and violent criminal organizations, not just in South America, but all of the world. And they're truly global now, being that they have strong bases in Africa and Europe. Okay, and the next story we have is regarding Colombian cocaine trafficking. We just talked about Brazilian, now we're going to its neighbor, Colombia. This story is regarding a meeting that occurred on February 3rd between the government of Colombian President Gustavo Petro and delegates from the Gaitanese Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, better known as Clan del Golfo. despite its military-sounding name, the most powerful cocaine trafficking organization in Colombia. And the most prominent person from Clan del Golfo at the meeting was Jobanis de Jesus Avila, better known as Chiquito Malo. And he's thought to be the most powerful leader of Clan del Golfo. It used to be a man named Otoniel. He was arrested a couple of years ago, and he is now serving a 45-year prison sentence in the United States. And since then, it is alleged that Chiquito Malo has become the leader of Clan del Golfo. What's known about this meeting comes from a government spokesman who said that the two parties talked about territorial transformation, paths to ending the criminal structure. Colombia has a long history of negotiating with